I fear that with all of the incredible distortions with regard to Durban that have been reflected in the media in particular, that the message of Durban and the purpose of this enterprise often gets lost. The purpose being a global movement against the very real challenges of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. It is precisely this challenge that mobilized the international human rights and anti-racism community in 2001 during the Durban conference to come together. It is precisely the seriousness of this challenge and the promise of the Durban Declaration. Jessica, thanks for encouraging everybody to read it. I've done a number of presentations on this issue through the years. I always begin by asking how many people in the room have read the Durban Declaration. There's rarely a single hand that goes up, and yet often many people in the room have been involved in the critique of the Durban Declaration. So starting with a fact-based analysis, I think it's vital to read it, and you will find out in doing so why it is that the vast majority of member states in the world and the international human rights and anti-racism communities almost across the board are enthusiastic supporters of the 2001 conference at Durban, of the Durban Declaration, and of the review process which is now approaching. That message sometimes gets lost by some of the distortions that we see, but there is a global anti-racism movement that considers this to be a very high-stakes game. Not because racism was not a huge problem in 2001, it was, but we are now, if you read the many reports of the United Nations human rights mechanisms, including the treaty bodies and the special rapporteurs and the many independent mechanisms, as well as the reports of non-governmental human rights organizations, you will see that we are living in a moment when racism globally is resurgent. That this is a human rights crisis of the first order in all parts of the world. And that's why the civil society organizations and the UN human rights mechanisms and all of us have invested so much in making sure that this is a successful review process. If you look at what happened after the Durban Declaration, it was only 2 days later that September 11th and the attacks on the United States occurred, which had the result of doing a couple of things. One, in distracting the attention of the international community from the very real scourge of racism around the world, and a new focus on issues such as counterterrorism, which have not always been pursued in a way which is respectful of human rights. And indeed, in many ways since September 11th, we have seen things like racial profiling and the targeting of particular ethnic and religious groups, not least Muslims in the world, to have reached a fever pitch and to raise new concerns about racism and related intolerance. But at the same time, we have seen, mostly because of economic pressures that have emerged since then, a real targeting as well of migrants in societies around the world, a rise of xenophobia in various places, the denial of asylum, for example, to refugees as a result of all of this. And as I say, this is a global phenomenon. These problems exist with regard to particular groups in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, South Asia, North America, Africa, across the board. While the groups that are targeted may be different, the phenomenon of racism, racial discrimination, and related intolerance, as I say, very much at a fever pitch. The concern that many of us have had is that because the defensive politics of Durban and what has come since Durban has focused attention on making sure that perpetrators are not held accountable, that they are shielded from critique, we have lost the point of the exercise, which is to stand in solidarity with victims, whoever and wherever they may be, which is the point of the international human rights movement. So I know that as the questions come out, we'll be able to address some of these challenges in particular, but just to say that the degree to which we can focus on what this is really supposed to be about, which is solidarity with the victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and not the shielding of perpetrators. And doing so in accordance with international standards adopted by this organization since 1945, then we will have achieved something which I think we can describe as a success. And with that, I'll stop, and I think we can take questions.